The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 12 degrees below zero when Martha Henderson woke that January morning in 1942. She didn't need to look at it to know the cold had come. The frost patterns on the inside of the bedroom window told her everything. In the darkness before dawn, she could hear the wind howling across the Nebraska plains, rattling the barn doors and making the whole farmhouse creak like an old ship at sea. Her husband Tom had already gone out to check on the dairy cows, his boots crunching across snow so cold it squeaked under his weight. But Martha had her own emergency to handle: the chickens. In cold like this, eggs could freeze solid in their nests within an hour of being laid. A frozen egg was more than just a ruined breakfast. It was lost income at a time when every penny counted. It was protein her family couldn't afford to waste. And if too many eggs froze and cracked, it could mean her hens would start eating their own eggs, a habit nearly impossible to break once it started. She wrapped herself in 2 sweaters and her heavy wool coat, pulled on Tom's spare work gloves, and stepped out into the brutal cold. The wind hit her face like a slap, making her eyes water instantly. The tears froze on her cheeks before she reached the chicken coop. This was the kind of cold that killed livestock, the kind of cold that turned carelessness into tragedy. Most people today think farming back then was simple. You threw some feed to the animals, collected eggs, and called it a day. But the reality was far more complex. Every season brought its own set of challenges that required ingenuity, traditional knowledge, and quick thinking. Winter egg collection wasn't just about staying warm. It was about understanding chicken behavior, temperature science, and timing everything perfectly to save what your family needed to survive. The Henderson farm wasn't unusual for its time. 40 acres of cropland, a small dairy operation, and a flock of 30 laying hens that provided eggs for the family, and a little extra income from sales to neighbors and the general store in town. Tom's parents had built the place in 1920, and now in the middle of World War II, with Tom classified 4F due to an old farming accident that left him with a permanent limp. They were doing their part for the war effort by producing food. But producing food in the middle of a Nebraska winter required knowledge that didn't come from books. It came from experience, from neighbors, from trial and error, and from tricks passed down through generations of farmers who had learned the hard way what worked and what didn't. When Martha reached the chicken coop, she paused before opening the door. This moment was critical. Opening the door too quickly would let in a blast of cold air that could shock the birds and disrupt their laying. She cracked it open slowly, slipped inside, and closed it behind her immediately. The difference in temperature was noticeable but not dramatic. The coop was maybe 25 degrees inside, still below freezing, but not the deadly cold outside. The chickens were huddled together on their roosts, their feathers fluffed up to create insulating air pockets. Several hens were already in the nesting boxes, and Martha knew why. Chickens naturally laid eggs in the early morning hours, triggered by the lengthening daylight as dawn approached. In summer, this timing was perfect, but in winter, it created a serious problem. The eggs would be laid in the coldest part of the night, and they'd sit in those nesting boxes for hours before most farmers made their morning rounds. An egg starts at about 106 degrees when it's laid, matching the hen's body temperature. But it loses heat rapidly in cold air. The egg white begins to freeze at around 30 degrees, and the yolk at around 28 degrees. Once an egg freezes, the expanding ice cracks the shell, making it unusable for sale and risky, even for home consumption. The Henderson family couldn't afford to lose eggs this way. Martha had learned her technique from Tom's mother, who had learned it from her mother-in-law, stretching back generations. The trick wasn't complicated, but it required discipline and perfect timing. She reached into the first nesting box and her gloved hand found 2 warm eggs. She transferred them immediately into the deep pockets of her coat, which she'd lined with wool fabric, specifically for this purpose. The eggs needed to be collected within 30 minutes of being laid to prevent freezing, which meant Martha had to know her hens' schedules. She moved methodically from box to box, her practiced hands recognizing which nests were occupied and which were empty. Some hens protested with soft clucks and shifted position. Others had already finished and left their nests. In total, she collected 18 eggs on this first round, but her work was far from done. This was where most people misunderstood winter egg collection. It wasn't a once-a-day job. During extreme cold, farmers had to collect eggs multiple times before sunrise, then several more times throughout the day. Martha would make 4 trips to the coop before breakfast. Tom would make 3 more during his morning chores. Their teenage daughter Helen would check the nests during her lunch break from helping with the indoor work. By the end of a bitter cold day, someone from the Henderson family would have visited that chicken coop a dozen times. The science behind this approach was simple but critical. Eggs contain mostly water, and water expands when it freezes. The expansion creates pressure inside the shell that eventually causes cracks. But the process isn't instant. An egg sitting in a 20-degree coop will stay liquid for about 45 minutes before ice crystals start forming. If you collect every 30 to 40 minutes, you stay ahead of the freezing point. Miss that window and you start losing eggs. But there was more to the Henderson method than just frequent collection. Martha had modified her nesting boxes using techniques she'd learned from other farm women at church socials and community gatherings. These informal networks of rural women shared practical knowledge that often meant the difference between a productive winter and a disastrous one. Each nesting box in the Henderson coop had extra straw bedding, packed thick at the bottom and sides. Straw is an excellent insulator, trapping air between its hollow stems. But Martha had added something else. Under the straw layer, she'd placed burlap bags stuffed with dry leaves and corn husks. This created an insulating barrier between the cold floor and the nesting area. She replaced this insulation every 2 weeks because damp insulation loses its effectiveness. The walls of the coop itself had been prepared for winter back in October. Tom had stuffed the gaps between boards with dried moss and clay, then covered the exterior with tar paper. The roof had an extra layer of old canvas. The windows, which provided necessary ventilation in summer, were covered with wooden shutters that could be opened or closed depending on the temperature. On nights like this one, they stayed closed. But insulation alone wasn't enough. The Hendersons had learned that lesson the hard way during the brutal winter of 1936, when they lost nearly a third of their flock to the cold. The problem was moisture. Chickens produce a surprising amount of moisture through respiration and droppings. In a sealed, insulated coop, this moisture would condense on the cold surfaces, creating frost and dampness that made the cold even more dangerous. Chickens could handle cold temperatures, but they couldn't handle cold plus dampness. So Tom had installed a ventilation system that seemed counterintuitive at first. He'd cut small openings near the roof peak on opposite ends of the coop. These allowed moisture-laden air to escape while preventing direct drafts on the birds. Cold air came in, yes, but it entered high and sank slowly, staying above the roosting area. The chickens stayed dry, which kept them warmer than they would have been in a completely sealed space. Martha finished her second round of collection, adding 9 more eggs to her coat pockets. She could feel their warmth against her sides, a small comfort in the pre-dawn cold. But she knew this technique had its own requirements. The eggs couldn't stay in her pockets too long either. If she waited too long before getting back to the house, her own body heat would start the development process in fertilized eggs, which they needed to avoid since they sold eating eggs, not hatching eggs. Back in the kitchen, she transferred the eggs to a large ceramic bowl she kept on the counter, away from the heat of the stove, but not near the cold exterior wall. Temperature management for eggs didn't end with collection. Eggs stored too cold would freeze in storage. Eggs stored too warm would age too quickly. The ideal storage temperature was between 40 and 50 degrees, which in a farmhouse in winter meant finding the coolest interior space, usually a pantry or cellar entrance. The Henderson family used a wooden egg cabinet that Tom had built, positioned in the back hallway where the temperature stayed relatively stable. The cabinet had multiple drawers lined with wood shavings, and Martha placed each egg pointed end down, which helped preserve quality. This positioning kept the air cell, which formed at the larger end at the top of the egg away from the yolk. If eggs were stored wrong side up, the air cell could shift and bacteria could more easily penetrate the egg. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of pink and gold, Martha made her third trip to the coop. The temperature had risen to 8 below zero, a slight improvement. She collected 14 more eggs. The hens were more active now, moving around the coop, waiting for their morning feed. Martha scattered cracked corn and kitchen scraps, watching to make sure each bird got her share. A well-fed hen laid better through winter than one that struggled for nutrition. The Hendersons' approach to winter feeding was another crucial piece of the puzzle. Most people don't realize that chickens need more calories in winter, not less. They burn energy staying warm, and that energy has to come from somewhere. Tom kept the feed barrel in the barn where it stayed cold but not frozen, and he'd learned to add extra corn to the mix during deep cold snaps. Corn is high in carbohydrates, and carbohydrates generate heat during digestion. On the coldest nights, Tom would give the flock an extra feeding right before sunset, so they had fuel to burn through the long, bitter darkness. Water was its own challenge. Chickens need constant access to unfrozen water to maintain egg production. The Hendersons used a technique that many farmers developed independently. They kept 2 watering containers. One stayed in the coop at all times, the other was in the house thawing. Every few hours, they'd swap them, bringing the frozen one inside to melt while the fresh one went out. On extremely cold days, they'd make this swap every 2 hours. It was labor-intensive, but it worked. Some farmers tried heating their water with kerosene lamps placed under the containers, but this was dangerous. Chicken coops filled with dry straw were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. The Hendersons had heard stories of farmers who'd lost their entire coops to fire, and they weren't willing to risk it. The extra trips to swap water containers were safer. By the time the sun was fully up, Martha had collected 43 eggs. She'd made 4 trips to the coop, spent nearly 2 hours in the cold, and her hands ached from the repeated exposure to freezing temperatures despite her gloves. But they hadn't lost a single egg to freezing. Those 43 eggs represented several days' worth of protein for the family, plus enough extras to trade at the store for sugar and flour. In wartime, with rationing in effect, every egg mattered. The techniques the Hendersons used weren't unique to their farm. Across the rural Midwest and throughout cold-weather farming regions, families developed similar approaches based on the same fundamental principles. Understanding chicken behavior, managing temperature and moisture, timing collection to prevent freezing, using insulation effectively, maintaining the flock's health and nutrition, but each family added their own innovations. Martha's neighbor, Ruth Johnson, swore by placing large stones in the nesting boxes. She'd heat the stones in her kitchen oven during the evening, wrap them in old towels and place them under the straw bedding at night. The stones would retain heat for several hours, keeping the nests just warm enough to prevent the first eggs of the morning from freezing. Martha had tried this technique, but found it too labor-intensive for her schedule. Still, she knew it worked well for the Johnson family. Another neighbor, Frank Mueller, had built a small room within his chicken coop, a heavily insulated inner chamber where the nesting boxes were located. The main coop stayed cold, but the nesting room, heated by the chicken's own body warmth and additional insulation, maintained temperatures above freezing even on the coldest nights. This reduced the number of collection rounds needed, but it required significant carpentry skills and materials that not every farmer could afford. The Hendersons' approach balanced effectiveness with practicality. They couldn't afford Frank Mueller's elaborate construction. They didn't have time for Ruth Johnson's stone heating method, but their system of frequent collection, good insulation, and proper ventilation worked reliably year after year. By mid-morning, Tom came in from the barn, stomping snow from his boots. The cows were fine, he reported. The water tank heater was working. He'd need to break ice in the outdoor troughs later, but for now everything was under control. He warmed his hands by the stove while Martha started breakfast. She cracked 4 eggs into a bowl, checking each one carefully. Even with careful collection, sometimes an egg would develop a hairline crack from the rapid temperature changes. These eggs were still perfectly safe to eat immediately, but they couldn't be stored. The Henderson family had learned to use any damaged eggs right away, wasting nothing. As she cooked, Martha thought about her mother-in-law, who'd taught her these techniques 20 years earlier. The old woman had been stern but patient, explaining that farming wasn't about fighting nature. It was about understanding it and working with it. "A chicken wants to lay eggs," she'd said. "Your job is to make sure those eggs survive long enough to be useful. Temperature, timing, and attention to detail. That's all it takes." But that all it takes represented hours of extra work every single day during winter. It meant waking before dawn regardless of how little sleep you'd gotten. It meant going out into dangerous cold multiple times each morning. It meant paying constant attention to small details that could mean the difference between success and failure. This was the reality of farming that often gets romanticized or forgotten. Yes, there was satisfaction in producing your own food. Yes, there was beauty in the snow-covered fields and the pink sunrise. But there was also relentless, exhausting work that never stopped, regardless of weather or personal circumstances. The Hendersons' daughter Helen came downstairs, dressed for the day. At 16, she was old enough to manage many farm tasks independently. After breakfast, she'd take over the egg collection duties until evening, making her rounds every hour. This would free Martha to handle other work: baking bread, mending clothes, preparing the noon meal, and a dozen other tasks that kept the household running. Tom would spend his day managing the dairy operation, repairing equipment, and cutting ice from the pond to store in the ice house for summer use. Every member of the family had their responsibilities, and all of those responsibilities increased during winter's harsh conditions. As the family ate breakfast, they discussed the day's priorities. The weather forecast, shared via radio and telephone party line, predicted the cold snap would last 3 more days. This meant maintaining their intensive egg collection schedule through the week. It meant extra vigilance with all the livestock. It meant being prepared for emergencies. Tom mentioned that he'd need to check on their elderly neighbor, Mr. Peterson, whose wife had passed away the previous fall. Living alone at 73, Peterson might need help with his own small flock. This was another aspect of rural life during this era. Neighbors looked out for each other because isolation and harsh weather made independence dangerous. The Henderson family would check on Peterson, help him collect eggs if needed, maybe bring him some fresh bread, and offer to split firewood. These mutual support networks were how rural communities survived. No family could do everything alone. Knowledge, labor, and resources were shared freely because everyone understood they might need help next time. The egg collection techniques Martha used weren't secrets. She'd learned them from others and would gladly teach them to anyone who asked. By noon, Helen had made 2 collection rounds, gathering 28 more eggs. The temperature had climbed to 5 degrees above zero, practically tropical compared to the morning. Martha used some of the morning's eggs to make noodles for soup, another to glaze bread dough, and set aside 2 dozen for sale when weather permitted a trip to town. The egg cabinet was filling up nicely, but Martha knew she couldn't relax her collection schedule. The forecast predicted another temperature drop after sunset. Tonight would be even colder than last night, possibly 20 below zero. That meant preparing the coop again, checking insulation, making sure the ventilation openings weren't blocked by snow, and getting ready for another series of pre-dawn collection rounds. Tom spent part of his afternoon reinforcing the coop door, which had developed a gap where the constant opening and closing had worn the hinges. Even a small gap could let in enough cold air to create problems. He also added fresh straw to the nesting boxes, packed thick and deep. Helen helped him carry in an extra bale from the barn loft, spreading it throughout the coop to provide additional insulation on the floor. These preparations weren't optional. They were the difference between maintaining egg production through winter and watching your flock struggle, stop laying, or even die from the cold. Chickens are remarkably hardy birds when properly cared for, but they're vulnerable to extreme cold combined with poor management. As evening approached, Martha made another round of collections. The hens were settling in for the night, clustering together on their roosts for warmth. She collected the last eggs of the day, bringing the total to 79. This was actually slightly above their average, which was encouraging. It meant the flock was healthy and the temperature management was working. Back in the house, she cleaned and inspected each egg, sorting them by size and quality. The very best would be saved for potential sale. Medium quality eggs would be used for baking. Any questionable eggs would be cracked and inspected immediately, then fed to the family dogs if they didn't pass muster. Nothing was wasted on a farm. Tom came in from evening chores reporting that all the animals were settled for the night. He'd given the chickens their extra corn feeding, swapped the water containers one last time, and double-checked all the barn doors and latches. Now the family could settle in for the evening, but Martha's alarm clock was set for 4 o'clock in the morning. She'd start the whole process again, checking the thermometer, bundling up against the cold and making that first crucial collection round before the eggs could freeze. This routine would continue for 3 more days until the cold snap broke. Then it would ease slightly but not stop. Throughout January and February, the coldest months, the Hendersons would maintain their intensive collection schedule. In March, as temperatures moderated, they'd gradually reduce the frequency. By April, they'd return to twice-daily collections, and by May, once daily morning collection would be sufficient. But for now, in the depths of winter 1942, survival meant attention to detail, hard work, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. The technique Martha used wasn't written in any book. It wasn't taught in agricultural colleges. It was practical knowledge developed by farmers who'd learned through experience what worked and what didn't. This knowledge represented something important that's often lost in modern discussions of farming. It wasn't just about the physical techniques, though those mattered. It was about understanding the natural world well enough to work within its constraints. It was about developing systems that were sustainable without modern technology. It was about community knowledge sharing that helped everyone survive and thrive. The Hendersons' egg collection method worked because it addressed every aspect of the problem. Temperature management through insulation and ventilation, timing based on understanding chicken behavior, frequent monitoring to catch problems early, proper storage to maintain quality, and the dedication to perform these tasks reliably, day after day, regardless of personal comfort or convenience. As Martha finally settled into bed that night, listening to the wind howl outside, she felt the satisfaction that comes from work done well. Tomorrow would be another long day of cold and constant vigilance, but the egg cabinet was full, the flock was healthy, and her family had the food they needed. In the context of wartime and winter on the Nebraska plains, that was success. The techniques she used weren't miraculous. They were simply the accumulated wisdom of people who'd learned to observe, adapt, and persevere. They represent a kind of knowledge that's easy to dismiss in an age of climate-controlled barns and automated egg collection. But understanding how people solved problems without modern technology offers valuable lessons about self-reliance, resourcefulness, and the importance of traditional knowledge. For farmers across the cold regions of America, during the 1930s through the 1970s, keeping eggs from freezing before sunrise wasn't a minor concern. It was a critical skill that directly impacted family survival and farm economics. The tricks they developed, refined, and shared represent genuine problem-solving wisdom that deserves to be remembered and appreciated. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed learning about the traditional farm wisdom that helped families survive harsh winters, please consider subscribing to our channel for more stories from America's agricultural heritage. Give this video a like and share it with anyone who appreciates the ingenuity and hard work of past generations. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to life. This video is inspired by real events and historical practices used by American farmers during the 1930s through 1970s. The content is not intended to represent or offend any individual or group. Martha Henderson is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farm women who faced similar situations during this era. The techniques and challenges described here were common across rural America, and this story honors their resilience and practical wisdom.